There is one development inside a relationship with a narcissist that their entire system was never designed to survive. Not confrontation, not anger, not the dramatic ultimatum. It is the quiet moment when the target simply begins to understand what has actually been happening. And once that understanding arrives, everything the narcissist does next reveals exactly what they were always trying to hide. There is a quality that every manipulation system requires in order to function, one that is so fundamental to its operation that without it, no individual tactic, however sophisticated, can produce its intended effect. The target must not know what is happening. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's tactical sophistication is not the source of their power in the relationship. The invisibility of the tactics is the source of their power. The gaslighting works because the target doesn't recognize it as gaslighting. They experience it as their own confusion, their own memory failing, their own perception being revealed as unreliable. The guilt induction works because the target doesn't recognize it as a manufactured emotional state. They experience it as genuine responsibility for genuine harm. The idealization and devaluation cycle works because the target doesn't recognize it as a cycle. They experience each phase as a specific, contextually explained event rather than as a predictable structural pattern. Remove the invisibility, and what remains is a collection of tactics without targets' approaches, designed to exploit vulnerabilities that the target's awareness has now closed. This is the invisibility dependency. And the narcissist's panic when recognition occurs is not simply the frustration of a plan being disrupted. It is the specific alarm response of a system that has just lost its most fundamental operating condition. Pay attention to what happens in the narcissist's behavior the moment they detect that the target's perception has shifted, because this detection is itself revealing. What most people don't realize is that narcissists monitor the subtle behavioral signals of the people around them with a sensitivity that most people never develop. Because for the narcissist, this monitoring was never simply social attentiveness. It was operational intelligence. And the signal they are most calibrated to detect, the one that produces the most immediate and least controlled response, is the specific shift in how they are being looked at. Not with more anger, not with more distress, but with a quality of clear, calm observation that was never present before. Most people miss this warning sign because the narcissist's response to being recognized often looks, initially, like ordinary escalation of familiar behavior. The hidden reason it is qualitatively different is that the escalation is no longer tactical. It is reactive, and reactive behavior from a personality that was always operating tactically reveals the panic beneath the performance more clearly than anything the narcissist would ever choose to communicate. There is a paradox at the center of the narcissist's response to being recognized that most people never have the opportunity to observe, because observing it requires having reached the specific state of awareness that triggers it. And that state, once reached, changes the quality of observation so completely that what the narcissist does next becomes, for the first time, fully legible. The escalation makes the pattern more visible. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's instinctive response to compromised invisibility, deploying the same tactics with greater force, is the response most likely to accelerate the recognition it was designed to suppress. During the period when the tactics were invisible, their subtlety was a feature. The gaslighting was quiet enough to seem like reasonable disagreement. The guilt induction was calibrated enough to seem like genuine hurt feelings. The manipulation was sophisticated enough to seem like ordinary relationship dynamics. But a tactic deployed with urgency loses its subtlety. The gaslighting that was previously delivered with enough plausibility to create genuine doubt now arrives with an insistence that reveals the investment behind it. The guilt induction that previously felt like authentic emotional response now carries a mechanical quality the same structure, the same escalation pattern, the same pivot points that pattern recognition makes impossible to experience as spontaneous. Pay attention to what this escalation reveals in real time because it functions as confirmation rather than correction. Each amplified tactic that the target now recognizes becomes additional evidence of the pattern they were already identifying. The narcissist, attempting to reassert control through force, is simultaneously providing the clearest demonstration, yet, of exactly what was always being done and why. Most people miss this warning sign because the escalation feels threatening in the moment. The hidden reason it is actually the most informative behavioral sequence in the entire dynamic is that it was never chosen. It was produced automatically by a system encountering resistance. It was never designed to manage. This is where the sudden charm reinstatement arrives, often simultaneously with the escalation, sometimes immediately following it. And the juxtaposition of these two responses, occurring in close proximity, is itself one of the most revealing behavioral signals the narcissist ever produces. The warmth that returns is not the warmth of a person who has genuinely reflected and changed. It carries a specific quality that is almost impossible to describe until you have experienced both the authentic version in the relationship's earliest phase and this reinstated version in the aftermath of being recognized. The authentic idealization, whatever its manipulation function, had a quality of apparent spontaneity. The reinstated version has a quality of deployment, of something being activated rather than something being felt. Most people miss this warning sign because what is being offered looks identical to what was offered before. The hidden reason it feels different is that this time you can see the hand that is extending it. There is a specific behavioral shift that occurs when the narcissist moves from suspecting that their patterns have been recognized to confirming it. And this shift is most visible in the specific domain of the relationship where the narcissist's control was always most dependent on a particular condition being maintained. The target's self-doubt. What most people don't realize is that gaslighting was never simply a tactic deployed opportunistically during conflicts. It was the foundational maintenance system of the entire dynamic, the continuous low-level process through which the narcissist kept the target's perception of reality sufficiently uncertain to prevent the kind of clear, stable observation that pattern recognition requires. A target who trusts their own perception sees patterns. A target whose perception has been systematically undermined sees only isolated incidents, each one explainable, each one separate from the others, each one processed through a filter of self-doubt that prevents the underlying structure from becoming visible. When recognition occurs, despite the gaslighting's maintenance, when the target's perception reasserts itself clearly enough to identify what has been happening, the gaslighting intensification that follows reveals something about its previous function that the subtler version was specifically designed to conceal. It was never about the specific disagreement it appeared to be about. It was always about maintaining the internal condition in the target that made all other tactics possible. Pay attention to the specific quality of the intensified gaslighting, because it is different from what preceded it. Previous gaslighting had the texture of plausible disagreement. The intensified version has the texture of urgency. The narcissist is no longer simply maintaining confusion. They are attempting to rebuild it from a foundation that pattern recognition has already compromised, and the effort required to do this, now visible in the insistence and specificity of the challenge to the target's perception, reveals how much work the subtler version was always quietly doing. This is where the isolation acceleration becomes the most strategically significant behavioral response in the post-recognition sequence. Because while the gaslighting attempts to rebuild the internal condition that made manipulation possible, the isolation acceleration attempts to remove the external conditions that are making the gaslighting's reconstruction most difficult. Most people miss this warning sign because the isolation behaviors that intensify after recognition look identical to the isolation behaviors that preceded it. The hidden reason they are functionally different is the urgency behind them. Previously, isolation served the gradual purpose of reducing access to outside perspectives that might have accelerated the target's recognition. Now, isolation serves the emergency purpose of cutting off the validation, confirmation, and additional perspective that might consolidate the recognition that has already occurred before it becomes stable enough to be unshakable. The narcissist is not simply trying to limit outside contact. They are trying to reach the target's emerging understanding before it solidifies, to introduce enough doubt, enough alternative explanation, enough contradictory input to prevent the pattern recognition from becoming the stable foundation for a new and clear-eyed perspective on the entire relationship. There is a pivot in the narcissist's behavioral response to being recognized that arrives when the escalation has failed to restore confusion. The charm reinstatement has failed to reset positive engagement. The gaslighting has failed to rebuild the self doubt it depended on, and the isolation has failed to cut off the outside perspectives that were consolidating the target's understanding. The vulnerability performance arrives. What most people don't realize is that this pivot represents the narcissist's most sophisticated response to the specific problem that recognition has created. Because every preceding response attempted to restore the conditions that made manipulation possible by suppressing the target's awareness. The vulnerability performance takes a different approach entirely. It does not attempt to suppress the awareness. It attempts to redirect it. A target who is observing patterns with analytical clarity is a target whose attention is directed outward, toward the narcissist's behavior, toward the structure of the dynamic, toward the evidence that has been accumulating across the relationship's history. The vulnerability performance pulls that attention inward toward the narcissist's apparent suffering, toward the empathy that the target's own emotional nature makes available, toward the specific experience of watching someone appear to genuinely fall apart in front of them. Pay attention to what this redirection accomplishes in terms of the target's analytical state, because it is the most targeted disruption of pattern recognition available to the narcissist. At this stage, the analytical attention that was examining behavior is now being asked to manage suffering. The clear-eyed observation that was identifying tactics is now being presented with apparent authenticity that seems to exist in a different register from the patterns that were just being recognized. Most people miss this warning sign because the vulnerability looks genuinely different from everything that preceded it. The hidden reason this difference is the tactic, rather than despite it, is that the narcissist has access to a detailed inventory of exactly what genuine distress looks like to this specific target, and has deployed that knowledge to produce the most convincing possible simulation of it at the moment when simulation would be most strategically useful. This is where the narrative preemption campaign reveals itself as the most consequential behavior the narcissist engages in during the post-recognition period. Because while the vulnerability performance attempts to manage the target's internal state, the narrative preemption campaign attempts to manage the social environment that the target's emerging understanding might reach. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's social management during this period is not simply self-protective. It is offensive, a preemptive strike against a credibility the target hasn't yet attempted to establish, designed to ensure that when the target's understanding does produce an account of the relationship's actual dynamics, the audience for that account has already been prepared to receive it skeptically. The specific content of the preemptive narrative follows a pattern precise enough to be predicted. The target is characterized as having changed, as being difficult, as being emotionally unstable in ways that their recent behavior, which was actually the behavioral evidence of recognition producing clarity, can be reframed as confirming. The relationship's dynamics get reconstructed in a version that positions the narcissist's escalating control behaviors as reasonable responses to the target's deteriorating emotional state. Pay attention to the timing of this campaign relative to the target's recognition, because it begins before the target has produced any competing account. The preemption is not a response to something the target did. It is a response to something the narcissist detected, the shift in perception that they knew, from the moment they detected it, would eventually produce an account they could not control. Most people miss this warning sign because the preemptive narrative reaches its audience before the target's understanding has consolidated into something expressible. By the time the target is ready to describe what they observed, the social environment has already been prepared to interpret that description through a frame the narcissist installed. The hidden reason this is the most strategically significant response in the entire post. Recognition sequence is that it operates on the social infrastructure rather than on the target directly. And social infrastructure, once shaped, is considerably more difficult to reshape than an individual's perception. There is a behavioral sequence that emerges in the narcissist's approach to the target once the initial panic responses have run their course. Once the escalation has failed, the charm reinstatement has produced no reset. The gaslighting has encountered a self-trust it cannot fully undermine, and the vulnerability performance has been observed with the same analytical clarity that preceded it. The narcissist begins to audit. What most people don't realize is that the testing behavior that emerges in this phase is qualitatively different from the ordinary boundary. Testing that characterizes the narcissist's behavior throughout the relationship. Ordinary boundary testing probes for compliance, for the identification of which limits will hold and which will yield under specific forms of pressure. The testing behavior that follows recognition probes for something more specific, the extent of the understanding. The narcissist deploys individual tactics in relative isolation. A specific guilt induction here, a targeted piece of gaslighting there, a carefully constructed vulnerability display in a particular context, and observes the response with the specific attention of someone trying to determine which patterns have been seen and which remain operative. Each tactic that produces no reaction is a tactic that has been recognized. Each tactic that still produces its expected response is a tactic that remains available. Pay attention to what this auditing behavior reveals about the narcissist's internal experience of the post-recognition period, because it communicates something that the escalation and the charm reinstatement were both designed to conceal. The narcissist is afraid of what you know, and the audit is the behavioral expression of that fear, trying to calculate its own dimensions. Most people miss this warning sign because it looks like a return to normal behavior. The hidden reason it is the opposite is visible in the quality of attention accompanying it, the specific monitoring awareness that was never present in the original deployment of these tactics, because the original deployment was confident. This is where the discard as control recovery reveals itself as the final response in the post-recognition sequence, and the most strategically revealing of all. When the narcissist audit concludes that the target's understanding is sufficiently complete to make continued manipulation ineffective across enough dimensions to compromise the relationship's operational value, a decision is made, the target gets discarded. But the discard is framed, carefully, urgently, and with the specific attention to narrative that characterizes everything the narcissist does when their image is at stake as the narcissist's own choice. Most people miss this warning sign because the discard, in this context, looks like the relationship ending for the reasons the narcissist describes. The hidden reason it is actually a control recovery operation is visible in the timing, which correlates precisely with the recognition, not with any relationship event. The stated reasons reference. The narcissist is not leaving because of what they claim. They are leaving because staying with someone who can now see clearly has become operationally untenable, And framing the departure as their own decision is the final attempt to ensure that even the ending remains under their narrative control. What most people don't realize is that the panic the narcissist experiences when their patterns are recognized is not simply the frustration of a plan being disrupted. It is the structural alarm of a personality that has no alternative operating mode, no genuine relational capacity to fall back on when the tactical system fails, no authentic engagement to offer when the performance is no longer sustainable, no real foundation to stand on when the invisible architecture has been exposed to the light. Every behavior in the post recognition sequence was an attempt to restore the darkness that the understanding had removed. Pay attention to what that reveals about everything that happened before the recognition arrived. The manipulation was never the relationship's dysfunction. It was the relationship's entirety. And the panic that followed being seen was simply the system's honest response to encountering. For the first time, someone who could see it clearly enough to understand exactly what it was.